All right. Well, I'm here with Michael W. Austin. What's the W stand for?
Warren.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm on your website here, and I'm just gonna read this sort of quick bio. It says you're a philosophy professor, author, and speaker. You teach, write, and speak based mostly on ethical questions related to character and human flourishing. And says that you live in Kentucky. You speak for the Kentucky Humanities Council, which is fascinating to me. And the reason you're here is because, well, honestly, it was I was drawn to the book cover. With all the recent things about guns, I remember doing some research after the Las Vegas shooting at the Las Vegas event. I forget how long ago that was. And then just a little bit dipping into these things about guns, not having grown up around guns and all that, but just recently with these last several mass shootings, went looking for different resources, and your title with Bullseye,
Yeah.
really interestingly covered. So you wrote a book, God and Guns in America. You throw those three words together, God, Guns, America.
Yeah.
It's eye-catching. But yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit more about yourself. Any background that might help us understand where you're coming from when it comes to entering into this sort of conversation, and why you decided to write a book about guns.
Yeah, you bet. So I say some of this, I think, in the book, for sure some of it. But yeah, I grew up outside of Kansas City, in the sort of the southern suburbs, right by the farms on the Kansas side. So growing up in Kansas, similar to Kentucky in many ways, and at least in the more rural areas, like hunting's a big thing. I grew up, my dad had a gun cabinet in the downstairs family room when we were growing up, where he stored his guns, and ours. And so I have memories of like going shooting trap and skeet, those kind of things growing up, going hunting out in western Kansas with freezing rain. Some of those things scar you, right? Because sheets of ice on you. But anyway, so I grew up around them. Then later he got a safe to just secure them. But yeah, so I grew up with them. And now I'm not like that active into shooting or hunting, and just over the years, other stuff, especially after having kids, free time I had and want to do other things with. But as far as the book goes, I don't remember exactly when. This would have been maybe 2015, 2016, something like that. I think I just started reading, coming across people writing about guns, and especially from a Christian perspective. And then, a lot of proof texting, right? Just pull out a Bible verse, and that's supposed to support your view about the Second Amendment, primarily on this more pro kind of strong gun rights side of things. Although you see it on both sides for sure. And I just thought, well, that can't be what that verse means. So started thinking and writing, did the Christian Research Journal, kind of a debate back and forth with a guy on that. I think that's available free online now. That was like the first thing I wrote about it, apart from just some online stuff. I have a blog at Psychology Today called Ethics for Everyone. I did some writing there. And all that to say, then I think I just got into like a lot of things, you kind of know I knew my general thoughts about this, but a lot of times you write to figure out what you think, right? Because I hadn't looked deeply at this stuff. So I did that. And that's what led it. I mean, a lot of the stuff in philosophy, it's like you hear something that sounds plausible, a view that I like, or something that you're like, well, that doesn't seem right. And then you just dive in one way or the other. So yeah, that's kind of what led to the book being written with Erdman's. And they were looking for somebody to write a book, I think, sort of like this, that wasn't, because I'm sort of, you sort of have like Shane Claiborne, who I love the stuff he does on the more, probably to the left of me, so to speak. And there's a ton of stuff to the right of me. And I'm kind of in the middle-ish somewhere.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit. I mean, well, actually, I think, I'm not sure, is Shane from Kentucky, or I know he
Tennessee. Yeah, Tennessee. Close.
I feel so bad that I confuse those different. Yeah, that's terrible. But
no, that's all right.
Yeah, and the Claibornes live here in Kensington. down the street from where we live. And I hope I can actually get him to come and share his perspective. But yeah, there's also a lot of content, videos and stuff of his sharing online. So, but yeah, maybe on that note, right? Could you kind of situate, broadly speaking, coming especially from a Christian perspective, you're saying there's a lot of more right perspectives, and then you would say, Shane, maybe be considered a little farther left than you are, and you would be a little bit between that. I saw in your book you had this kind of language of there's pacifism, just war theory, and then peace building. That's at least for one category. But yeah, maybe for other aspects of talking about guns, and how would you situate yourself in the different opinions, the conversations?
So where I am, it's sort of like the 1 or 2 sentence overview is that I think if I was going to sum up the book in a couple sentences, it'd be something like, that we can reduce gun violence in America. So it's focused on guns in the United States. We can reduce gun violence in America while protecting the rights of responsible gun owners. And as Christians, we especially have strong reasons to want to do that, right? So I think I've always identified as a just war theorist in past years. When people talk about pacifism, my objections weren't very original. It's like, well, what about Hitler, or what about self-defense or defending your family? All those sort of standard things and important things there. That's why, some of those kind of issues are why I wouldn't classify myself as a pacifist. I think I'm about as, I say this a lot, I'm about as close to one as you can be without really actually being one, because as I did the work on this book, reading through scripture, both, and commentators, people who are scholars of the Old and New Testament, writing about that stuff, even the Old Testament. I read a book about kind of nonviolence in the Old Testament. And I think especially when we think of the Old Testament, people think of, well, the violent episodes that happened there, the wars that Israel, and different kind of punishments. But the Old Testament says God hates violence, and he won't allow David into the temple because he was a warrior. There's a lot of things that we gloss over, I think. And then, of course, the New Testament, Jesus says, put away your sword. The Sermon on the Mount. So anyway, I guess I'm in there. So you've got people, I think maybe Shane and others who are just pacifists, and I have deep respect for that view. It's not where I am rationally, but I have an emotional pull to it. And then I think what bothered me more as a philosopher and someone doing Christian ethics is just people identified as Christians, pretty far to the right on the issue, and their arguments really were more like talking points or cliches, or things you could pull out of an NRA website or something. So they didn't seem to be uniquely Christian to me, and sometimes when they were, it was troubling. It seemed like to misuse it. But I think there are some arguments you can ground, right, the right to own some kind of firearm, I think, in the right to life, right to self-defense, those sorts of things. But that's perfectly consistent morally, and then of course in the United States legally, with all kinds of restrictions on who can have guns, where you can have them, what kind. Supreme Court has said that, and that's just consistent with the nature of rights. They're usually limited by potential for harm to others. And so that's whether it's our speech rights, I can't yell fire in a crowded theater, that classic thing you talk about in high school social studies class. Freedom of religion has limits, harm to others. Like, if it doesn't matter if, my religion tells me I should sacrifice Tom Brady to the god Thor, so he'll be happy, I can't do that. All right.
Yeah.
Just to pick a random person as a Chiefs fan. But so yeah, so I think that's what peace building, no, let's see what you want to talk about next. Because in some ways, my view is just like, it's just war theory, but actually taking some of the criteria much more seriously than people seem to do, like that it's a last resort, for example. But I think the key difference is that the peace building said, it doesn't just say, is violence justified? That's a crucial question, but it goes that further and says, even if it's justified, is there other way to solve this issue, resolve the conflict? It takes that further step towards putting the real burden on choosing to engage in acts of violence, whether that's internationally or locally.
So I hear that as it's like a proactive stance towards actually getting to the, trying to make those limit situations that everyone, or immediately jumps to when it comes to ethics. What about if this happens, right?
Yeah.
Like making those much less likely, and sacrificially putting out our energy, right, towards the big things. Like, I was watching a debate between, on the both sides, and they're both agreeing we need to, for example, I live here in North Philadelphia. We need to invest more money in the cities, right, to make our communities more robust. And you can have bigger, much broader conversations about reparations, all these things. And by the time when you're just having such a violent environment that you're scared for your life, that you're like, well, I have a right to own a gun. That's just not as ideal of a conversation to be having as, well, let's actually proactively, from Christian perspective, actually get into the mix to make the community better, right? Safer in so many more ways, right? And I saw that both sides actually agree on that. And that actually connects to, I've heard pacifist perspectives call it, like, sometimes we resort to lack of creative solutions. Like the only thing you can do right away is return violence for defensive violence. And what about creative ways to de-escalate? What about other kinds of things? But anyways, this seems like what you're trying to talk about. And well, I want to return to one of the things you said. You're in the book, you talk about rights and different kinds of rights, and you sort of touched on this just now. But like, we can have a sort of picture that's almost just this aesthetic picture of like maximizing our freedom, right? That's what America's about. It's about freedom. This sense of like, don't add more restrictions to me, oppressive American government. Which is, I think, one of the feelings that we can feel when it comes to these conversations about, restrictions on gun laws, and anything from, you have to have background checks to, what kinds of things can be sold, or restrictions on manufacturers. But I found helpful you talking about these different dimensions to rights, and how when we live together, it's not as simple as just saying maximizing my rights, right? Because our rights might infringe on each other if we maximize them. So I don't know if you could give us a little bit more of a picture of how that works.
Yeah, you bet. I think that part of that conversation, and you have this, each, is the loud lawnmower coming through on your end? I can't.
Oh, no, I can't.
Like mowing the yard. Okay, good. So I have a filter on. It must be working, but in my office it's loud. It seems like only whenever I'm doing an interview or a podcast, that's when it's time to mow. All right. So anyway, let me talk about rights. So I think that in America, like, it's not a deep insight, so just a really deep individualism is big, right? Maximizing my freedom, right, or my family, or what I want, my choices. And look, that's good. I mean, in terms of, I'm all for rights and freedom and that kind of thing. But yeah, when you live in a community, then that's just naturally, morally, and then of course legally as well, those things have to be limited. So I can't just, my rights, and it looks, in general, people go back to John Stuart Mill talked about this, and people in the discussions of rights today, our rights end where someone else's rights or welfare or something like that begins, right? So my right to do whatever I want with my hand ends where your face is, or something like that, just because I want to like swing my fist, as to use a kind of one of those goofy examples. So yeah, I think that there are, if it was really just maximizing my freedom, that opens itself up to really some of the problems we have, right? The resources I use, and not worrying about what that does to other people, right, who have a lack of resources. Or there's some issues in environmental ethics where our waste or trash or chemical waste ends up, whether it's in the poor parts of our country, or it gets shipped out overseas to other places. And so our rights are important, but they're not absolute. Maybe is one way to put it. Right. There are few, if any, absolute rights. Maybe the right to life, depending, and people, of course, would argue about that with capital punishment and other things. But of course, that's probably the strongest one. If you don't have the right to life, don't have really any other rights, they're all contingent on that. So I think that just because I want something in and of itself, that's not a sufficient reason to have the thing or to want to do something to engage in it. I've got to consider the impact on others. That's got to be part of the moral calculus, so to speak. And it's got to be, I mean, legally it has to be too. That's because for society to function, right? We have to make small, sometimes larger sacrifices for the common good.
Yeah. Well, so how would you, in the current sort of discourse, or in the current way things are, how would you assess sort of how the balancing of different rights and vis-a-vis guns and each other, and all these statistics citing about how the US is like, our violence is crazy compared to other countries, we just came off of the Buffalo explicitly white supremacist shooting. Mm-hmm. And my family members were thankfully safe from the Taiwanese shooting, church shooting right after that, and then of course now we're grieving this Texas elementary school shooting, which are terrible. But of course after that it's always suddenly everybody's yelling the talking points again.
Yeah. Right.
Thoughts and prayers. Are you kidding me? That's just a way of saying we don't want any action understood as political action to actually get something done to, like, in relation to more restrictions on guns. But yeah, how do you think, when you're thinking about this rights, balancing them, help us see some of your opinions as you waded into all the complexities there. What are some of your opinions, whether it comes to policy or manufacturers or any of these things that you think should be done?
Yeah, so I think, like, at that rights level of conversation, the strongest argument for the right to own a gun is right to life, right to self-defense, defense of others. But the right to, I think some people who make that argument about self-defense, then they make it that right absolute, but this right to self-defense is not absolute. I can't have a small nuclear device and say it's for self-defense. Or an RPG, or morally speaking, they're real. And why? Well, because they're so destructive, and we don't want that kind of power in the hands of one person with no accountability or oversight or that kind of thing. And so, but taking that right to self-defense to own a firearm, it's perfectly consistent with limits, right? So yeah, I don't want to wade into the debate about assault weapons. People want to argue about the definitions of that stuff. It doesn't even matter to me in terms of those, just what the things are. It's not a coincidence that so many of these shootings are done with AR-15s, right? From what I understand, lightweight, right? You can fire a weapon like that a lot of rounds more quickly, right, than a lot of other. So I guess, yeah, I'm the same. I've looked at that debate, it comes back up, like you said, the sort of talking points and people saying stuff. And like this time there's a party that was just like, I'm not even going to engage, but this is kind of one of the issues I've decided to focus on, not just writing a book, but in terms of sort of trying to do some things policy wise and culture wise. So yeah, I guess I would say that same thing, that the right to own a gun, right to own a firearm from the Second Amendment, that's legally, it's got limits, right? The Supreme Court was only explicitly said in 2008, 2010, that the Second Amendment applies also to an individual's right to own firearms. But then they said that's perfectly consistent with all kinds of limits about what you can have, where you can have it, who can have it. So it's some people, I can't remember who it was, a politician from the Democratic Party said like one simple law would fix this issue. Well, in some cases that might be true, but I think to say we're going to get rid of gun violence in America anytime soon is pretty unrealistic for a variety of reasons, but we can reduce it. And in fact, at the state level, there's some things that have been done that have been shown to reduce it. I'm for the universal background checks. I'm not sure it's not going to make a huge difference, but you have to think of these laws as like a net, so to speak, or a screen. And just like any other law, people are still going to do bad things, they're going to get access to things, but when there are barriers to access, that makes it more difficult. And so fewer people can get guns, for example. And so you think of the different laws as like overlaying screens or nets, where it's harder and harder for somebody who shouldn't have a firearm to gain access to one. You can do that, and there are laws that will do that while also protecting the rights of responsible gun owners. So I think one thing, and I was happy to see this come up more recently with the school shooting, red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders. I think that's one that you can see has worked at the state level. I talk about this in the book. The book came out in 2020, so this is from a few years back, but in Maryland, right, a sheriff talked about these red flag laws, and that basically for what that is it gives a legal recourse for somebody who's concerned. So let's say I'm a parent, I have 3 daughters, but let's say I've got an 18-year-old son or a 21-year-old son, and I'm concerned that he's showing signs of maybe some kind of instability, or he's talking about committing violent acts, or let's say he's got a bunch of guns. Or maybe I think maybe it's not violence directed outwards. Maybe I'm concerned that he seems potentially suicidal. So red flag law allows me to through the police, I can do this, medical professional, the police, I can file something with the court. And so there can be a hearing, have his guns taken away. It could be upwards for a year. And then you have another hearing, and like the court finds that he shouldn't own a firearm because it is a danger to himself or others, they're taken away. If not, then he keeps them. But let's say that they're taken away, then you have another hearing, say in a year's time, and he can get them again or not. So like in Maryland, when this was first put into play, I think it was Montgomery County in Maryland, the sheriff talked about 300 of these that they had where the guns were confiscated, and he said I think 6 of them were potential school shootings. So wow. This is something that as long as there's due process, right, that I can't just because you can see this being abused. Let's say that a domestic violence situation, let's say maybe someone's partner has a gun, and you can imagine people abusing it. They're a danger to themselves, and then the gun gets taken away, and then I can abuse them or something. So you can have due process, but yeah, this is something that it's hard for me to see. And this is one people that I've talked to who are more conservative on gun rights than me. It seems to be one that there's more openness to, as long as there's due process is in play, because then it's this concern about, if you're really concerned about getting guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, then this is seems to be a really good way to do that. And so that's probably one of the things I'm strongest. But then I think too, I want to, especially as Christians, think about, you mentioned this point about creative nonviolence, creative solutions, instead of just going to a gun, de-escalating. If you think about think about warfare in general, the amount of money and resources that the United States, for example, pours into the defense, our national defense, and the creativity, right, of weapons, plane, all the stuff. What if we just maybe not necessarily governmental, but Christian company or something, just I don't care who, somebody pours some resources and time and creativity into developing a really effective non-lethal weapons? Because if the reason, which the majority of people these days who own firearms give for why they have a gun, is self-defense, that's a change from maybe 30 or 40 years ago. It was hunting and recreation. Especially as Christians, if I could have a non-lethal weapon that was effective in keeping somebody from harming me or my family or somebody, that just seems like an obvious thing that you would want as a believer.
What tasers are?
Because you're protecting what's that? Yeah, tasers, but I'm thinking something maybe that's even more effective, right? But yeah, there are things like that. So I remember looking, when I was doing the book, looking at different things like that. So that's for sure a possibility, a really good one. And what if there's something that was even more?
Yeah.
Because those don't always work, and of course nothing's going to always work. But yeah, that's a good example. Right. Because then not only then are we protect those rights to my right to life, right to life, people I love, right to protect myself, but also as a Christian, the bad guys, right, whoever it is, everybody's made in God's image. I think that's one thing that bothers me about Christian talk about this, is there's a denigration of criminals. And I'm not saying, they're someone who's willing to harm others, they're less moral. but they don't have less moral worth, right? Because they're human. We all have that baseline intrinsic dignity is made in God's image. And so if I can protect myself as an image bearer, those I love as image bearers, from an image bearer who's doing something wrong while not killing that image bearer, that's the best possible solution I can imagine in terms of using a weapon. Now, of course, there are, and I mentioned these in the book, there are all kinds of stories about people who have de-escalated, right? Whether through just actually a moment when a guy reloaded, which is during a reload, a guy at the Waffle House in Tennessee a few years back, he disarmed him. People have talked their way out of this. And so I'm not saying that that's always going to work, of course not, but it works more than people realize.
Yeah, I'm really curious. I mean, this is I'm trying to decide which direction. So like there was a comment, I'm gonna butcher it. I kind of wrote a couple words down, but earlier on the book you were talking about rural versus urban, and kind of the guns as almost a symbolic thing for like industrialization, and kind of this again, I'm butchering how you said it, maybe leaving rural people behind, and like this sense of like, this is our symbol of but yeah, I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, and just kind of the divide we see. I mean, you're in Kentucky, and I'm sure you see a much different reality, the people around you and your discourse, and the way guns are imagined, right? Even how people see and feel about guns and being around guns, versus kind of in general. Of course, we're talking broad strokes, but in general, when it comes to settings, I live in Kensington, which is one of the most struggling, urban environments, with all the issues that come with it. And then, of course, like white versus black and brown, but yeah, I wonder if you could help us. I mean, again, your unique situatedness in Kentucky, to me, means that you see something differently when it comes to that. So I wonder if you could kind of help us with that.
Yeah. So I think, a side note, the urban rural thing, what's interesting is that like the majority of people who have guns and who kind of make the arguments about freedom and safety, they tend to be people who are least likely to be a victim of violence, like of criminal violence, right? So it's white, rural, maybe, I can't remember the wealth issue. Whereas, there's a book called Do Guns Make Us Free by a philosopher named Furman De Brabander, which I read, which has a really good discussion of some of this stuff in terms of, because he lives in Baltimore. So, right, similar sort of situation with violence and guns. So about that kind of issue, and that the people who are often more likely to be victims of gun violence want the guns gone. They don't want to be more armed. Generally speaking. But yeah, then there's this issue, I think, of what you're getting, it has to more do with, and I see that here, I see it some in Kansas, but it's more pronounced here than I remember as a kid growing up, is that guns take on this, I mean, maybe mythic, or they're symbolic of, they become a part of people's identity in a certain way, their views about guns. And so, like, I think of a barbershop in town that I go to sometimes. There's a guy, one of the barbers was talking to, I think it was another guy working there, and he's and he like pulls out this little handgun he just has in his front pocket, like in the barbershop. Like, okay, and something his dad gave to him that his grandfather passed down. So sometimes the guns take on this sort of family, like they become family heirlooms, is the way to put it, I guess. And so there's an emotional attachment there. In Kentucky, I think I started seeing, I see another barbershop I go to, there's a guy that just has a whole, he's got it holstering a gun all the time. Pizza delivery guy, I mean, you just see it, which to me, that wasn't true in Kansas when I grew up. And then after Kansas, I lived in grad school in Southern California, and then Boulder, Colorado, not really places where people carry guns or even allowed to like that. So I think for sure in parts of the South, some of the Midwest and the West, different areas of the country. So there's that family stuff that comes in. There is a conflation of like being an American and owning a gun, right? That form of American exceptionalism. I think religious faith gets put into that, right? I think it was Wayne LaPierre who said this. I have to go back and check that the right to own a gun is a right God gave all Americans, right? That's that all Americans thing that's even more striking. I mean, I've got enough issues with the right to own a gun coming from God. I've got a long way to get to that conclusion than just a claim, but that he gave to Americans, that's real. Well, it's just ludicrous, right? God doesn't give rights to particular nations anymore. Maybe Israel would be the exception, of course. But so yeah, I think there's this. So I guess what I'm talking about some of the book, and it's hard to capture but I think when you think about your identity, so things that are close to your sense of who you are, maybe could have, like, for many people, it's a religious faith, could be parent, father, son, brother, Christian, whatever it is. And then I think guns get sort of intertwined in all that stuff for many people. So when I say, we need to have more restrictions on guns, that feels like a personal attack in many ways to people. You're attacking a part of who I am. So even, administrative assistant for one of the departments a couple of years ago before the book came out, she said, I heard you're writing a book called God and Guns in America. And I said, yeah. She goes, well, that's what we believe in, God and guns, right? So that kind of captures it, right? It's a weird two things to believe in together. I'm not even sure what it means to believe in guns. I guess strong gun rights, but I think that's why.
Yeah, and then in that scenario, then because I've listened to, I pay attention to words a lot and how different people use different words and how it triggers different people. And I'm very flexible about what word to use, because I'd prefer not people would be triggered by the word, so that I can get into a deeper conversation. I guess I want to get into a deeper conversation rather than just allow whatever word I have to settle on preventing a deeper conversation. And one language is like common sense gun laws, right? Yeah. And when you're saying that, you're saying it's so deep as a part of them. So if you're going to restrict guns, it's almost like you're restricting me, right? Yeah. To say common sense, it starts to sound very demeaning, because it's not common sense to me. My common sense, my visceral reaction is, you're putting me in a straitjacket. I guess I'm trying to imagine that, right? I mean, and I'm not talking about myself. That person that that hears that common sense language, that is just like, are you saying you're crazy?
And then to them, common sense is like, why does it matter to you if I carry a gun for self-protection? Like, common sense is I need to protect myself and my family. And so I may even do it in a book. I've used that common sense language before. I've tried to move away from it, because it's now everybody just kind of uses that for not just in gun debate, but in anything, right? They just, we just need common sense, this, a common sense approach, almost becomes empty rhetoric. And I think you're right. Then it becomes like, well, this is the side of common sense. If you're against it, then you're irrational. Or worse. So I've tried to focus on just this language of reducing gun violence, because it gets away from it. When someone says, then people say, look, you're never going to stop all gun violence. I'm like, maybe not, right? I mean, there are a lot of countries that have done things that have got drastic reductions, and there are places where there is no gun violence. America's not going to be like that because of our Second Amendment rights, but we can reduce it while protecting those rights. And I think that's common ground. So I've tried to move away from the common sense stuff more to like, what common ground is there? Because there is some common ground when you start looking at what people say they want in surveys and thinking. I mean, even something like 80 in the 80th percentile, 80% and a little bit more people, for example, want universal background checks, right? To make and then that and even depending on the survey, members of the NRA, different surveys have shown anywhere from like 52 or 53% upwards to the mid 80s, right? So the membership of the NRA is not as polarized on the issue as the leadership, which is interesting. And then even white evangelicals are only 2 or 3% behind the general population on that question. So that where there is common ground on some of these things, right? Which
that's very surprising.
Yeah, it is surprising,
because what I would imagine based on the language or is you just kind of see the kind of, and I'm not trying to be demeaning, but you see the kind of like in the imagination of the liberal whatever, and I'm probably would categorize by others as that, but like is like, oh, the gun people, it's just the gun toting MAGA guy that Jordan Klepper makes fun of on his YouTube videos,
Yeah.
right? Like the guy that's, has no common sense, right?
Yeah.
I know that, and that again, but yeah, when I saw things like that recently, that it's like actually a lot of the people that actually want guns are also very passionate about, and may actually just disagree. They precisely think that having more guns would make things safer or whatever, and they want to end they don't have the same end goals in mind. They just think that these mediating steps are wrong, so that they have a different common sense than we do, which means they live in a different reality, right? Part of me has wondered if we weren't a United States, if we were just different countries, like 50 different countries, and we all have 50 different laws about guns, whether that would have ended up like, okay, maybe this culture here, they all have guns, every single person, but they all don't commit gun violence. I mean, I personally wouldn't really want to live there because I don't really want to own a gun. And and then in this place, 0 guns, and like they have like a very sophisticated way to prevent any guns from anywhere getting near. I don't know. I've wondered about the cultural dimension of that. So yeah. Anyways, I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I want to kind of go back to, because you slipped in the NRA, and
Yeah.
I don't think you could talk about this stuff. I mean, for the everyman like me, you just see, like, these days we just see like everything's the system, right? Everything's the system. Everything's this big hidden entities that are behind everything. They've got all the money, and they're like influencing things in shadow ways. And we're all stuck down here fighting each other about things, but it's really about these big systems. And that's the perspective, the intuition coming from where like a more progressive, or like, generally that progressive leaning environment that we see. How would you agree with, nuance, challenge, help us better understand from your perspective what you've learned about the NRA?
Yeah.
Is it like that? Are they just this, like,
Yeah, I think I mentioned this. I think on Twitter, maybe after the school shooting, I said if I could change something about the book, of course I could come up with several other things, but the thing that jumps to mind recently is I think I would have been harsher in my criticism of the NRA, because especially the leadership, because it's bizarre. Like Wayne LaPierre, who's just been shown to like misuse funds. I mean, millions of dollars over the years. He just got reelected again, like by the board electing him to be whatever his title is, president or something like that, NRA, whatever it is. So that there's definitely like a group of people in power there, doing stuff. And yeah, I think what the NRA has done, and so this is where I think I'd be more negative, is they've become more extreme, both in their language and in their positions, and then the phrasing. They've been effective at getting that into the consciousness of so many people, and people vote. They take that into the voting booth, right? So, abortion and guns, for example. I've talked to people. I have people that voted for Trump because of abortion and guns. Even people that I know well, family members, not immediate family, but. And in my mind, I'm like, yeah, it just astounds me. And there's just so I think, look, I don't know, I'm a philosophy professor in Richmond, Kentucky. What do I know about? but there are systems. I mean, I have gotten involved with Interfaith Council for Everytown for Gun Safety. So people that want, there's excellent, like, go to Everytown for Gun Safety's website. They've got all kinds of great research compiled about all kinds of gun issues. But yeah, there is a system in play, and when you hear, Ted Cruz or other people, really it's the Republican Party, obviously generally in power, saying the same things as the NRA, that's not a coincidence. And there is a bottleneck. I mean, 2019, I went with a group of, one of them was an NRA member, one of them was a survivor of the Columbine shooting, a friend of mine who's the Rob Schenck, president of Dietrich Bonhoeffer Society, who's part of it. Actually, you should, if you haven't seen this video, Armor of Light with Rob Schenck, it's a documentary. you can find it free online. It's excellent, because he was big in the pro-life movement for the 80s and 90s, and then sort of had this sort of crisis of conscience about guns and the Christian faith. But anyway, so we and a couple other people, we were like meeting with not senators, but I didn't realize till I did this that it's like 25-year-olds control the country, because they vet who gets what gets to the senators. But one of the things was, and since then the House of Representatives has passed like the universal background check bill, and McConnell won't let it come to the floor for a vote on discussion and a vote in the Senate. So I think I have some similar intuitions about systems and individuals, and I think in many ways it's this false dichotomy that people actually on both sides say, right? It's like an either or. No, it's a both and, because the systems shape the individuals help shape the systems, and but yeah, there's just when consistently the 85% of Americans say they support a certain, like universal background checks is the best example, but it never comes to a vote. It doesn't come to a vote. That's systems, right? That's people in power blocking something. So I think that's a serious issue. And even in some of those conversations, some of the people we talked to, really good. We talked to someone in Lindsey Graham's office, who I think it was Graham, maybe it was another South Carolina senator. Some of the arguments they gave back, most people just listened, because it was a weird group. It was like really conservative people, NRA, victims of gun violence, a mom whose son was killed by a random bullet in Lexington up the road from here, professor, right? Some of the arguments given back were just these weird scenarios. Well, if we had this red flag law, then I wouldn't be able, or if we universal background check, I wouldn't be able to like go hunting and give my friend a gun to use more out in the field. I'm just like, you can work around that. I mean, stuff like that, just silly scenarios that would be pretty easy to deal with. When you run up against irrational, what I would consider irrational arguments like that, that's a sign that something else is going on. So
interesting.
But yeah, here's one other thing about that. People don't take this, not enough people who want those restrictions, maybe red flag laws, background checks, magazine limits, maybe more restrictions on who can have guns, what kind of guns. Not enough people take that into the voting booth. That's the thing. So people, one thing the pro-life movement did very well was people were one issue voters on that, but a lot of people aren't taking their views about guns into the voting booth. It looks like, at least those who want restrictions, right? If those surveys are right, that 80% of people want background checks and other kind of restrictions, what's going on? Because a smaller number of people are controlling both the narrative and the laws.
That's interesting. Yeah. No, this is really generative. I mean, I what I appreciate about you is an attempt to kind of, it seems like, listen to different perspectives on their terms. I noticed in the book you quoted different, and then you're like, well, I really appreciate this. I can go with this. Here's how I'll kind of do a both and or thread between them.
Yeah.
But yeah, what perspectives do you feel like missing from the overall discourse, or overall? I know you've already mentioned some of these things about the red flag laws, but like,
yeah,
in your mind, I mean, if we as a country are people that after these shootings and things, we talk to each other, and we tend to probably just spout off the first thing that everyone else spouts off, and it's basically sharing, this is my intuition, this is how I feel, and this is yours, and thoughts and prayers. Oh, action, what is your intuition, because you've spent much more time thinking through these things, of what's missing, or what it'd be great to see more people educated about, or learning, or trying, in order to move things.
Yeah, I think I've seen this the mass shootings, and for obvious reasons, especially, I mean, some of the accounts of like well, I haven't read it in detail because I don't want to. I saw enough about like what it was like when law enforcement entered that room in the elementary school, what the little bodies looked like. Had to do DNA testing. They couldn't identify them. It's just horrible. But mass shoot, and for good reason, that those things become the center of conversation, and then it just it goes away. But it's because we think we shouldn't have to worry about. Well, we should never have to worry about being shot, unless we're doing something to harm somebody and the police are there or whatever. But I mean, I grew up not worrying about someone coming into my church with a gun or coming into my school with a gun. And while they're not, broadly speaking, it's not like the chances, if you just said pure probability of it happening, they're low, but compared to other things. But still, I think it's the fact that it is preventable, and it's just horrible, right? Young kids or people in the church or whatever it is. So, but really, it's steadily increased, right? In terms of like the deaths by gun violence each year in America, and a peak, the highest year ever was last year. I think it was right around 45,000 people. I think what gets left out of this a lot is that 2/3, roughly, the people who die by gun violence, so 2/3 of those 45,000 are by suicide by gun. And there are things we could do to help with that. And so the first thing people say back, it's kind of similar to what people say about other kinds of gun violence. Well, look, if somebody wants to kill themselves, they'll find a way. So even if you prevent them from having a gun. But just empirically, that's not true, because it looks like the evidence from what I've read recent years is that a lot of decisions about suicide, especially young, teenagers and younger people, are impulsive. And so if they didn't have easy access to a gun, it would subside. That's just what the numbers say. But two, and even in many ways relevant to the gun rights debate, is that these are the numbers won't be exact, but basically it's a sad way to put it. But if in terms of like methods of suicide, a gun is the most effective. So upper 80s to 90% of suicide attempts by gun are successful, whereas all other methods are in the 10 to 20% range. That's important, right? We could save a lot of lives. So what does that mean? It's not just, legally, I guess we start there. You can have legal stuff about mandated safe storage, right? Laws, so that if I've got a gun in my house, it's locked away. And where my teenage son or depressed, young adult or whoever doesn't have easy access to it. Trigger locks are a thing that can be done. I mentioned this in the book. There's one trigger lock. It's like your iPhone used to be, right? You just put a thumbprint, lock falls away. That means I'm the only one that can use it. And actually, that's a deterrent to gun crime as well, because someone wants to steal it. They're going to have to figure out how to get the trigger lock off without destroying the firearm. But then this is where Christians in the church can make a huge difference, because there's the access to guns for people who are having suicidal thoughts, but then how can we care for these people, right, who are struggling with that kind of mental illness or those kind of suicidal thoughts? And so there's the cultural, the social, there's the access to mental health care, and sometimes it seems like, and I'm speaking outside my expertise, but a lot of the mass shooters and then suicidal people, it's loneliness. It's the feeling of aloneness or hopelessness, those kind of things. And that's what we do, right? As a community, we can offer hope to people as they join our community, right? Community of a church in a local setting. And then of course, the hope people have in an authentic faith in Christ. So if we could put more of our resources into meeting people's physical, social, psychological, spiritual needs, if someone felt hopeless and alone, just imagine that. So in your neighborhood, and then we thought, well, this church, I've met some people there, they actually love each other, and I know people that have gone there and been taken care of and loved. That would be great to go there instead of to the closet to try to dig out a handgun.
Yeah, well, this has been rich. This is really I learned a lot from reading your book. I hope others read it too.
Thank you.
And I hope that I don't know what I think about all these things yet. you know. I hope that more of us can kind of like find ways to have a deliberate. I mean, not all of us can be philosophy professors. That, you know, I'm sure part of your job
Yeah.
study these things, but
Thank God.
right.
Yeah.
But we can be thoughtful in trying to listen well to each other, right? And my
Yeah.
intuition has always been, even if I have strong feelings, very strong feelings, if the other person is earnest as well, and like not just deceptive and not disingenuous, and actually open, you have to be open. But if the other person's open, if I have a genuine attempt to really listen and understand, there's much more likelihood, even if I'm right, to convince them than dismiss their crazy non-common sense position, you know. So I see what you're trying to do in this book as an attempt in that. I feel like the tenor of this conversation has been that as well.
Yeah, I try to do that, and I definitely, you know, over the years, there for sure, I can think of a handful of people, and I'm not perfect, obviously, so some missteps, or maybe just kind of the same thing. Someone says something, and especially on social media, where you take it the wrong way, or you take it personal, or it just gets your defenses go up. And it's okay to be passionate and even have a righteous anger that fuels your views, but there's also, like you said, this, what I'm striving for, and I definitely can see growth in my own life in this the past 5 or 6 years, is that kind of thing where, okay, instead of, this is shaped by Dallas Willard's talking about this kind of stuff, but instead of like face to face, like we are opponents and I'm trying to win an argument, and we are, but instead let's be shoulder to shoulder, look out, we're trying to figure out together, like what's true here. And asking questions, I think, for maybe this is a good way to think about it and kind of moving ahead, is instead of that, like, well, now why do you think, what reasons do you have for your view? Just ask somebody why, right? And not like challenging or like aggressive, but just, being curious, right? What reasons do you have? And then another question, like, are there any personal experiences that really have shaped your views here? That's a way to get at a deeper conversation. And I think, and then the last one would be like, what's the one thing you think people, let's say I'm having a conversation with like a strong pro-gun rights person. A good question I should ask them, and they should ask me, is like, what's one thing that you think someone like me is missing about your view? Like a point that you think is really important that supports your view that people tend to miss or don't see the significance of. Those kind of questions can get below all the, it's sort of gets to the deeper issues. And I think and from my experience in trying to do that kind of thing, it's not an intentional pun, but it actually does, it's disarming to people. Like the anger sort of gets short-circuited often, and right then you have a conversation, whether it's just, I've had that experience with strangers on Twitter, and I've had it with people in like these kind of talks and like group settings, and with others in different settings. So, and that's not just a gun issue, that's everything.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like no matter where you're standing on these issues, that's something that if you're especially if you're a follower of Christ, you don't have to be, and you believe in peacemaking, moving towards these
that's right,
postures. I know there's even debates about whether it's really that the issue in America is that we're polarized or not, but moving past even that, learning to listen to each other well. I think it's something that we can all learn to do better. And I attempt to do that, but I'm still learning to do that well, including this.
Yeah, well, and I think for go ahead.
Right.
Oh no, sorry. So and I think you're right. Whether Christian or just anyone else who's cares about moral decency at individual and societal level, there's the playbook now is just to be obnoxious and attack, and sort of, this is one of the things that one of the bad things that happened as a result of really with Trump being president, is just a lot of those norms that he broke. I see a lot of people doing that, and not just in politics, but in the church too, just the way people attack each other and say those kind of things. And if you want to be countercultural as a Christian, or just a countercultural human being, regardless of your views about faith and those kind of things, one way to do it is this, respond that way, not play that game. And gets us nowhere.
The higher road, take the higher road, right?
Yeah. Try to.
Yeah. Well, I followed you on Twitter right before the other day, and hopefully, you know, we're evolving, we're changing creatures. So, I mean, even in this conversation, you shared a little bit about how you've changed your perspective over time, some things, but I'm sure your perspective will change, or at least nuance or deepen over time. And you know, who knows if you'll be involved in other efforts to go to the White House or whatever, try to shift the conversation, and or if you'll find yourself involved in other things. But I'm looking forward to kind of continue to learn with you, learn from you. But yeah, I appreciate your time today. And yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that this is one step of trying to take action alongside our thoughts and prayers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, really appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good conversation. Thanks for the opportunity.